In a conflict that spanned 6 years of strife and aggression across many continents and a multitude of countries, the Second World War can certainly be said to have contained critical junctures, events that changed the course of the conflict dramatically. Europe had its Battle of Britain and Operation Barbarossa, while America's were Pearl Harbour and the following Battle for Midway. Each of these events were ultimately tipping points, the straw on the back of each side's war effort, creating tremendous repercussions. One of the most monumental was Japan's sneak attack on the American naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbour, which not only declared the Empire of the Rising Sun's position to the world, highlighting their alliance with Nazi Germany, but also awoke a nation to their place in the conflict, washing away a deep-seated isolationism that had kept the US out of the war to date. After the devastation of their navy at Pearl Harbour, President Roosevelt had the backing of the people, and simply no option but to bring the slumbering giant of their military might into play, their first target being those that perpetrated the attack, the Japanese. However, the build-up to such turning points is almost if not more important than the events themselves. To understand the reason for the attack on the American naval base and what led to it, we need to look back at Japan's invasion of neighbouring China and its dealings with other allied nations, most notably Great Britain. At this time in history, the UK held a lot of territory in the Far East, which they were keen to protect. Unfortunately, this led to an appeasement strategy being put in place, similar to the tact taken with Hitler and his European troop movements. Malaya, Burma, Singapore and Hong Kong were all precious British colonies, and these lay vulnerable to attack while Japan remained allied with Germany. The Japanese had already put pressure on Britain to close the Burma Road, one of the few routes left open to deliver aid to China, and it was clear that as the war continued against Germany, the might of the British Empire was diminishing considerably in the region. The Japanese, in the meantime, remained sceptical about their alliance with Adolf Hitler. As a member of the Tripartite Pact, Japanese politicians had been shocked that Germany had not informed them of the attack on the Soviet Union, which put them in an awkward position after their agreement with Stalin. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, was quick to side with Hitler, and dismissing his earlier treaty with the Soviet leader, now urged Japan to go to war with Russia from the east as Germany advanced across its borders from the west. The government were by now exasperated with their foreign minister and keen to be rid of him. So, Prime Minister Konoe, along with the entire cabinet, resigned in July 1941 to be reformed into a new government without him. But although Matsuoka's absence was a relief to many in Tokyo, Konoe was wary that Japan was moving rapidly towards the brink of a war which would soon be unavoidable. The Eastern Empire had already been spreading propaganda in support of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere to rally support for its venture to the South Pacific. The government claimed that this enterprise would place the people of Southeast Asia and China under the protection of Japan. Western empires had long taken advantage of the wealth of the Pacific, and Japan would now free Asia from European and American imperialism. But while those in the Pacific Islands began to truly believe that the Empire of the Rising Sun would be their salvation, the co-prosperity sphere was no more than an excuse for aggressive military expansionism. In early July, American intelligence picked up a message from an imperial conference held in Japan, which stated that preparation for a southward advance should be reinforced, and and by July the 18th, it was clear that Japan was preparing to venture further afield. This was something that the US didn't wish to happen, as they had territory of their own in the Philippines and Guam, which they were keen to protect. As a warning to the growing ambition of their Japanese neighbours across the water, the American military stepped up their presence in the area. With the influx of men into the American forces during the next year, further moves were made by the US to halt Japanese expansionism. In the summer of 1941, the White House decided to freeze Japanese assets so they could no longer purchase oil in America. With 80% of their oil imports being met by the United States, this was disastrous news for the Japanese. Emperor Hirohito was informed that the nation's oil stockpiles would be completely depleted within 2 years, which in turn of course meant that the Japanese military machine would no longer be able to function. Matters deteriorated for the Japanese yet again when they saw British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet America's President Roosevelt on a warship anchored off Newfoundland to discuss the situation in Europe and the Pacific in August 1941. This gave rise to the treaty known as the Atlantic Charter and advocated freedom from want and fear, the disarmament of aggressor nations, and stated that all people had a right to self-determination. To the West, this was a blueprint for the brave new world that the Allies prayed would emerge after the war had ended. But to the Japanese, it was a blueprint for Anglo-American world domination, and even a formal declaration of war couldn't have been more provocative. Over the coming year, relations between America and Japan became even more strained, with the empire's Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe repeatedly attempting to negotiate some sort of deal due to dwindling oil supplies. However, Roosevelt refused to meet with him until they'd pulled their forces out of China. Feeling unable to do this, and angered at his lack of ability to negate the impending conflict with the US, Konoe eventually resigned, leaving his country's leadership open to much more aggressive intentions, spearheaded by the strong personalities found at the head of the military. Throughout history, the Japanese were renowned for their fierce fighting and had once been led by samurai warriors who instilled the idea of bushido, or freedom from fear, in their soldiers. A true Japanese warrior should have no fear of death, pain or defeat, and no regard for himself, with his only purpose being to serve his master. But even with this extraordinary fearlessness instilled in the population, the fight ahead was going to be challenging. The United States had built up immense naval fleets and armies and would be a formidable opponent. The admiral of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, was well aware of what the country was up against and knew that to begin a war with America, the Imperial Army would have to do a great deal more than simply seize their outposts. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University, as well as spending time serving as a naval attaché in America, and he was one of the few Japanese commanders who really understood the immense naval power of the USA, and he told his government in no uncertain terms what was required. It is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. But despite his well-founded concerns about picking a fight with such a powerful nation as America, Yamamoto was loyal to his empire and dutifully began searching for the best way to overcome the US Navy. One tactic that he'd observed in the past would turn out to be a major inspiration for Pearl Harbour. In October 1940, the British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto had utilised torpedoes that were especially developed to work in shallow water. It was after this that Yamamoto realised a surprise attack on America would be far more effective than allowing them to respond directly in a straight shootout, crippling it before it could set sail for the Pacific theatre at all. In the spring of 1941, Japanese carrier pilots began training in the special tactics that would be essential in the attack plan, which would target Pearl Harbour in Hawaii. By the autumn, as Tojo took on the role of Prime Minister, Yamamoto saw that there was now no turning back. At the beginning of November, he assigned Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commander of the mission and set a date for the planned attack, December the 7th, 1941. Earlier, back in Washington, President Roosevelt was concerned about deteriorating relations with Japan and the risk this posed to American territory in the Pacific, and had elected to move the American fleet from its base in California to Hawaii, where it would be closer to the Pacific arena. Here, on the largest island of the archipelago at Pearl Harbour, the sailors soaked up the sun and enjoyed the beaches, with little idea that they were far closer to the troubles brewing overseas than they could possibly have imagined. As training and preparation of the Japanese forces continued leading up to the attack, a charade of diplomacy was continued, helping bolster the already heavy secrecy being employed by the Empire in regards to their impending strike. On the 20th of November, the Japanese ambassador to the US presented Japan's final ultimatum to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, demanding a resumption of oil supplies to Japan and the cessation of aid to China. Hull refused, reiterating the US position that Japan should withdraw all troops from the region and cease their invasion. With negotiations coming to a close, on November the 26th, 1941, the Japanese task force, comprising of 6 aircraft carriers accompanied by 24 supporting vessels, departed from Tankan Bay in the Kurile Islands in the strictest secrecy. Keeping radio silence to avoid detection, they crossed the North Pacific, avoiding the normal shipping lanes as they headed towards their destination 200 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was from here that the attack on Pearl Harbour would be launched. Due to diligent code breaking, the Allies had an inkling of an attack, but it was unknown from what direction it would come. With the breakdown of relations with the US, it was assumed it would be directed at them, but when or where Japan would make its move was anyone's guess. While the British and Americans watched for the first signs of belligerence from the Far East, in Nazi Germany, officials were jubilant about the prospect of a Japanese attack on Allied territory. The German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop had assured the Japanese ambassador in Berlin that Hitler would support its tripartite pact ally and declare war as soon as Japan went to war with the United States. Tokyo had in turn informed Germany that the time of this war may come quicker than anyone dreams. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, life went on as normal. American sailors were ashore, enjoying their tropical paradise as they played football or golf. And on the night of December the 6th, as sailors relaxed in the bars and clubs, many were dancing to the sounds of the Navy's musicians in a battle of the fleet dance bands. Staying up until the early hours, few would be prepared for the onslaught that lay ahead. But as night gave way to day, the first warning signs were breaking over the horizon. Some of them were diplomatic in nature, with a coded 13-part message being delivered by the Japanese government addressing their rejection of Secretary Hull's proposal. However, there was a crucial 14th part, which wasn't delivered until the morning of the attack. At 4:50 a.m. on Sunday, December the 7th, Japanese midget submarines stealthily entered through the harbour gates, but though they were spotted, no general alarm was given. Back in Washington, the tension was building as General George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's military advisor, had received the decoded 14th part of the message from Tokyo. It confirmed that negotiations with Japan had ended, and realizing the potential implications, the US War Department immediately sent an alert to Pearl Harbor. But problems with radio communications would delay the message, and tragically, the vital warning would arrive too late. While Washington was aware that hostilities were about to commence, on the other side of the Pacific, events were gathering pace as Japanese ships loaded with 5,000 troops from the war-torn battlefields of China approached British-controlled Malaya. Soon soldiers were storming onto the beaches and onto Allied territory, and the war on the West had begun. While the fury of the Japanese military was unleashed in the Pacific, radio transmissions between the Japanese carrier fleet near Hawaii and Tokyo ceased, and at 6:15 a.m, Vice Admiral Nagumo gave the order to release the planes. As the aircraft carriers pitched and rolled on the stormy seas, the first wave of 183 fighters, bombers and torpedo planes, commanded by Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, took to the sky. The vast formation included bombers which would target the battleships and aircraft carriers, followed by dive bombers to attack the land-based aircraft and hangars at Ford Island and Wheeler Field. Then came the Japanese fighter aircraft, assigned the task of destroying the planes on the airfields before they could take off and defend the harbour. Using music from a Honolulu radio station as a guiding beam to navigate, the enemy planes began to close in on their target. The fact that this music was playing gave the Japanese a great indication of how effective their stealth tactics had been. The American forces were completely unprepared for the attack that was about to commence. Just before 8 a.m, the first Japanese assault waves darkened the skies, sending the US military personnel that were awake into a frenzy of activity. Commander Logan C. Ramsey at the command center on Ford Island sounded the alert. Air raid on Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill. While the Japanese fighter planes began to swoop over Hickam and Wheeler airfields, rallying to the battle cries of Commander Fuchida. The Americans, believing there was no imminent threat, had made little effort to prepare themselves for attack, and the aircraft were neatly parked out in the open, wingtip to wingtip. Ammunition lockers were locked, and even the guns that could have provided some protection against the aerial onslaught were unmanned. There weren't even any torpedo nets to protect the American battleships, and as waves of bombers began to close in on the fleet, the torpedoes, developed to slice through the shallow depths of Pearl Harbor, devastated one target after the other. Of the more than 90 ships at anchor in Pearl Harbor, the main objective of the Japanese had been to strike the vessels moored on Battleship Row along the southeast shore of Ford Island. As tornadoes screamed through the air, hitting their targets with precision, The men aboard awoke to a tumult of smoke, fire, and deafening explosions. The battleships had little chance to defend themselves, and within the first minutes of the attack, all of the 7 anchored along the shore had been bombed or torpedoed. 2 sank, while the USS Arizona exploded in a giant ball of flames after an armour-piercing shell ignited the ship's forward ammunition magazine. It was the largest loss of life on any ship that day, with the crew of this particular vessel making up 50% of the casualties suffered by the US throughout the entire assault. As the naval base was thrown into pandemonium 30 minutes after the first attack, there was a short lull in the furious onslaught before a second wave of Japanese planes appeared over the harbour. By now, all around Pearl Harbor, civilians who had first thought the explosions were part of military maneuvers quickly became aware that they were under attack. The element of surprise had passed, however, and the US troops were now well aware of what they were facing. Anti-aircraft fire began to fight off the attacks, and some sailors even turned to machine guns and pistols as they battled desperately against the hail of missiles from the sky. Many heroes would emerge on this historical day, and one of those who fought bravely to defend the naval base was Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia. Despite having no training, he seized one of the anti-aircraft guns and began firing at Japanese planes until there was no ammunition left. But despite the bravery of Miller and all those fighting off the onslaught, the casualties suffered by Nagumo's pilots would be few compared to the devastating losses of the Americans. By 10 a.m, as the skies over the Hawaiian harbour fell silent 2 hours after the initial attack had begun, a trail of destruction lay around Pearl Harbor. As nurses and doctors rushed to tend the wounded, it was clear that the US fleet had been dealt a devastating blow. Over 2,400 Americans had been killed, including a number of civilians. Over 21 ships had been sunk or disabled, and almost 200 aircraft were destroyed, while over 150 were damaged as they stood on the ground. Virtually none had been able to take off to defend the base. However, the attack was not as devastating as it could have been. Despite the massive loss of life and material that the US Navy suffered, there were many small victories found within the greater battle. Admiral Yamamoto's failure to launch a third strike, due to fears of further losses, allowed most of the ships on Battleship Row to be salvaged, meaning they could return to war service within months, eventually taking the fight directly to the Japanese. On top of this, 3 US aircraft carriers weren't in the port as expected on that fateful day. They were in fact delivering aircraft to Wake Island, 250 miles west of Hawaii, leaving the American Navy far more capable than the Japanese had expected, despite the devastation of their initial raids. While the American people had maintained their hopes of staying out of the European war, as it was often thought of, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt finally had the backing of the people. On December the 8th, 1941, as crowds gathered outside the White House, the moment the Allies had been waiting for had come. President Roosevelt made an address, which was broadcast around the world, and the global conflict was now truly underway.
We will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.